Thanks, Stephen. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for inviting me along. Pleasure to be here. Banana skins, I think, Stephen, was how you described the sort of broad subject matter this evening. More specifically, I think what I'm going to try and do is give you my take, my view on how to cope when life unravels, about managing what I call proper problems, and in doing so, attempting to fail well. Before we start, though, I think I should explain my crisis credentials, if you like. So here's a bit more about my journey. I hate the word, actually, journey, and I blame Simon Cowell for it, because during his shows, there's always that ridiculous moment when contestants are shown a montage of their 15 minutes of fame before they're booted off back to obscurity, and they sort of refer to it as their journey. Now, my montage would in fact include two actual journeys. The first sat next to the President of the United States on his helicopter Marine One, flying through the rain and into the G20 meeting in Toronto. On board, the President, Barack Obama, my boss then, David Cameron, and me, Anoik from Essex. The second journey, as it happens almost exactly 4 years later, was in the back of a prison van, up the ramp from the underground car park below the Old Bailey. It was glorious sunshine that day, sunshine, in fact, that sort of streamed through the window of the van, windows that just at that moment I realized as we emerged onto Newgate Street were actually rose tinted. Serco, I can tell you, might be a bit average at security, but they are masters, absolute masters of irony. And an hour later, and I'm driving through the gates, or being driven through the gates of HMP Belmarsh, a high security prison which is straight out of central casting, I can tell you. I was told I'd only be there for the weekend, but I came back out of those gates and into and onto an open prison about 2 months later. It was the beginning of the end, if you like, of the worst journey of my life. So two moments there that I suppose summarize the highs and lows of my life, but they don't summarize, who I am at all. I wasn't in that helicopter because I'm some kind of strategic genius on whose words of wisdom the leader of the free world was hanging. I was a reasonably useful advisor to David Cameron, sure, but the truth is we were both in that helicopter. We were both in Marine One only because our helicopter had broken down, and the President offered us a lift. It was just luck. But nor was I in the prison van because I'm the criminal mastermind who, for, I can tell you, an utterly bizarre period of my life, I would hear myself being described as by men in wigs. No, I am sat here tonight, pleased as I am to be here, to offer a few views, really, as that former Downing Street advisor and national newspaper editor, someone who worked hard at doing a decent job for the large part, but who also screwed up spectacularly with some decisions that can be best described as suboptimal. Decisions, I can tell you, which led to my life unraveling, causing chaos for myself and others, and most importantly for the people I love. An unraveling that was made up of a 2-year wait before an 8.5-month trial, around 5 months in prison, another 5 months on tag and curfew, and then another 2 trials, which, had they gone the wrong way, could have caused my Zoom background this evening to look rather different. There'd be some bars, I suspect. But I'm also someone who's been lucky enough, and I mean lucky enough, to enjoy a fascinating, rewarding, challenging, and enormously fun career. I've had some dark days in some dark places, sure. But as someone who has created and managed crisis as a willing volunteer, and who later survived it as a conscript, if you like, I think I've been gifted, really, a unique perspective. And it's a perspective that's allowed me to fail well. And by accepting what happened to me, I found my way to a life that's better in so many ways than it was before. So this discussion this evening really is about the human side of crisis, because I can tell you that that is the real prize to chase should you ever find yourself in crisis or at the center of a crisis, because unless of course your health is permanently impacted or seriously impacted, crisis in my view really can change your life for the better. It's how you do that that I thought I'd concentrate on this evening, and it's timely. I think less because of Dominic Cummings, but more because we're all still going through the collective crisis of a pandemic. And although my crisis, which ran from 2011 to 2016, was obviously very different, not least because some of it was self-inflicted, I think that there are some commonalities. So I'm going to try and give a few practical takeaways, based on that perspective. The first, I think, is around the idea of control. The idea that to survive, maybe even thrive when crisis comes, you've got to be present, if you like, in your problem. You must accept what's happening to you. And you must accept entirely that there are things, possibly very painful and damaging things, that you have absolutely no control over. In my situation, I can tell you that it took me a while to get there. It took about a year, in fact. I left Number 10 in January 2011, but the crisis didn't really take hold until June of that year, when I was arrested for the first time. Things unraveled pretty quickly from there. I was, toxic. I was rendered unemployable, and the practicalities of life, all the stuff that shouldn't matter but that we know does, they all began to bite. Every day seemed to bring another piece of bad news, and I was really struggling to cope. I was struggling to accept how my life had fallen apart so comprehensively and so publicly. Not that as a former tabloid editor, by the way, I was in any position to moan about the scrutiny or the intrusion, and nor did I ever do that. But it was the speed, really, with which things fell apart that I was failing to understand or to get to kind of get my head around. The realization that what I built over a 25-year career turned out to be so incredibly fragile. But to borrow and adjust a well-known Dutch saying, reputation arrives on foot but leaves in a taxi. In my case, it left on a high-speed train, and as a result, for those 12 months, I couldn't really get a grip on what was happening to me and my family. I was getting through the days. I was trying to focus on those practicalities of an unraveling life, as I say, but I was absolutely in denial about what was happening. And that changed, and I can date it very specifically. That changed on May the 30th, 2012, with a 6 a.m. knock on the door from a very large, but as it turned out, perfectly friendly Scottish detective. He explained that I was being arrested again, and that I would be taken immediately to Glasgow for questioning. Now, on the basis that I lived in Forest Hill in South London, I rather naively asked him what time the flight was. We're driving, he said. And so 7 hours and several crosswords later, we drove over the border into Scotland. Police motorbike outriders sort of appeared either side of the van, and it turns out a very well informed newsreader on the car radio that we had turned on announced that I was going to Govan police station. And an hour or so later, I was sat minus my laces in a cell with one-way glass on the wall, a cell specifically built as a holding pen for terrorists. And that's when really, I can tell you that after 12 months of, as I say, denial, I finally surrendered control. And by doing so, I began the sort of process scientifically known as getting a bloody grip. And I was able to do so because of the utter absurdity of the situation that I now found myself in. My life was now officially beyond parody. And for the foreseeable future, there was absolutely nothing that I could do about it. So as I lay there on the first of what would be a number of plastic mattresses, I could write the Michelin Guide to prison cells, by the way. It dawned on me that although I had no control over what might happen, I had total absolute control of how it might affect me, how it would affect me, of how I would feel and of how I would react. That was entirely my choice. And I told myself, you know, you're breathing in and you're breathing out, and this is just another place to do those two things. It's a pretty unpleasant one, but one day you'll be doing those two things, but in better surroundings, you know, with your family around you, you know, with your dog at your feet, and hopefully with a decent glass of red in your hand. And so that became my mantra when I found myself in even darker places, including behind a door that stayed locked for a lot longer than it did on that day in Glasgow. A mantra that not only got me through those moments, but that also allowed me to concentrate fully on the elements of my crisis that I did have control of. And remember that there is a big difference between surrendering control and giving up. They are totally different things. You'll always have control of whether you give up. That's your choice. But you're very likely to not have control of the problem that's causing you to be in crisis in the first place. Now, I'm a big fan of history's greatest crisis managers, the Stoic philosophers, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and all that lot. On the subject of control, they likened it to an archer who has control of his aim, not of whether the arrow actually hits the target. There are so many things that can get in the way of that. The key factor for the archer is to keep trying, is to keep firing. Okay, so having accepted what you have control of and what you don't, you must then decide how you want your crisis story to end. And this is really the second point that I want to discuss. I'm a journalist by trade, a communicator, and I see things in narrative terms, but I think it's a really useful way to frame the next challenge, if you like, as a story with a headline. And I just want my life back is not the approach to take, in my view. You should aim higher, because the answer lies in who you are and who you want to be. And moving from the old you to the new you, well, you know, I think that's the gift that crisis can provide if you're prepared to confront it, if you're prepared to define it, and then you're prepared to really pursue it. And in pursuing it, you need to build a road that will take you there. And as strange and as corny, frankly, as I think it sounds, that road is paved with gold. The gold is those little moments of enlightenment or brilliance that help you direct, define, and achieve the ending you want. The difficulty is in finding them. And again, I apologize for it being so cheesy, because it is, but you know, I think of that process like a prospector panning for gold, right? Everything you experience when you're in crisis, everything goes in, but only the valuable bits, the nuggets, should remain. Everything else goes back into the river and goodbye forever. Now, these nuggets are made up of all sorts of stuff, and you have to stay alert to spot them. It can be another person, of course. I've made the most amazing friendships born out of crisis. Or it can be harder to define, an opportunity maybe, or it can just be a piece of advice, a line in a book, or a song lyric, or a moment in time. Whatever it is, you know, if it's golden, grab it, write it down, and put it to work. And I asked this question of my guests on my podcast, which Stephen kindly mentioned earlier, Crisis What Crisis. We call them crisis cures. And there's only one rule on the pod, it can't be another person. But despite that, we get amazing answers. Nikki Campbell, who I think either spoke to you recently or is going to, he chose the smell of the heather, the midges, and the rain in the Highlands. Mark Sedwell, Lord Sedwell, of this parish, chose the simple act of listening, or as he put it, you know, we have two ears and one mouth for a reason. Brilliant. And Nile Rodgers, you know, one of my heroes, chose John Coltrane's A Love Supreme. He said, if they ever put me in front of a firing squad and they offered me a cigarette or a drink, I'd say, no, just put on A Love Supreme and fire away. Once I got into the habit, I'd keep my gold list, my crisis cures, I still do on my phone. And they can come from the least unlikely angles. One of them for me, one of the most important ones for me, is a photo of my dog, Bob. Bob was golden. Actually, he was a Vizsla, so he's a sort of rusty brown color, but you get the point. He was my first dog. And on the day I came home from prison, he went absolutely bananas, as he'd done every time I came through the door for the previous 10 years, always with a shoe in his mouth. Now, not that long after I came home, Bob fell ill with cancer. We were told, in fact, that there wasn't much that we could do, and I was completely devastated. I was actually told the news as I waited at City Airport to fly to Edinburgh for the start of my second trial. I was asked recently, those of you who are dog lovers, I may lose you at this point, but I was asked recently if I ever cried at any point during my dramas. And I can tell you that I did that day, stood there at City Airport talking to the vet. Now, my trial ended well. And a few weeks later, I was back home, having been acquitted. In the meantime, Bob had had an operation, and he climbed out of his bed and tried to make a fuss of me as I arrived. And over the next few weeks, we spent a lot of time together. We sort of recovered together. And I watched him dealing with his, frankly, life and death crisis by simply being with the people that he loved. You know, me, my wife, Eloise, our 3 sons, getting fitter, but taking the time to sort of, you know, flop out on the ground in the sun as well. And when he was fit enough, you know, by running, towel wagging straight into the garden with the exact same level of enthusiasm every day, rain or shine, without judgment or bitterness, you know, I think Bob was setting me another brilliantly golden example of how to deal with crisis. Now, a very good friend of mine reckons, rather brilliantly, I think, that the key to life is to be the man your dog thinks you are. I'd put it slightly differently. Just be more like your dog. Finally, on the subject of gold, I would say be brutal about it. You get all sorts of opinions thrown at you when you're in crisis. Be super, super careful about whose opinions you choose to take seriously, because crisis tends to attract people who love drama. It's a drama magnet, and they're not necessarily the best people to be around. There's enough hysteria. You really don't need any more. So choose who you let in very carefully. If they've got a shoe in their mouth, by the way, no problem at all. Let them through the door. The third element of the crisis that I want to talk about is stress. These days, we like to combine any mention of stress with another word, anxiety. It's almost become one word, stress and anxiety. But I think they're very, very different things, obviously. And in my view, anxiety is to be avoided, of course, at all costs. But stress should be embraced. We're built for stress. It's how we've managed to survive this long. It's an essential part of being human. It's an essential part of surviving crisis. The stress response, of course, is designed to help us react when something potentially threatening happens. It's primal to help us deal with it and importantly, to learn from it. And there's solid research to show that stress can improve alertness, performance, cortisol kind of controls blood sugar levels, can regulate metabolism, reduce inflammation, even boost your memory. It's all good stuff. But stress, without doubt, helped me through my crisis, and it will help you through yours should you be unlucky enough to find yourself in one. But only if you're stress fit. And for me, although it was work that got me into trouble, it also, ironically enough, equipped me to survive. As I said earlier, I was a stress conscript for 5 years. But for the majority of my working life, I was an entirely willing, enthusiastic, though quite well paid volunteer. Editing a Sunday newspaper is a weekly crisis. It was a constant struggle, deeply competitive and deeply stressful, and I absolutely loved it. And having been a reporter beforehand for so long also had its benefits, especially when I was locked up, because I was able to go into reporter mode, treating it as an assignment, you know, only with truly shocking food and even worse expenses. But there were moments of real fascination for me. And politics, in a more intense way, was almost all stress. Not quite a daily crisis, but not far off. Certainly 2 a week, every week for 4 years. You know, your opinion sought on every one, strategy decided and, you know, executed almost always on the run. And the expenses scandal in 2009 was one of the most sort of acute and long-running examples. And for my boss, David Cameron, and for the party, frankly, for every MP it touched, and it touched, most, it felt like the end of the world. It was incredibly high octane and a high stakes situation. And each day for a solid fortnight, it would start again with another round of revelations from the Daily Telegraph, the Duck House, the Moat. You remember it all, I'm sure. But for me, as the person who was tasked with handling the communications impact, it really was like a stress Olympics. 2 weeks of round-the-clock rolling crisis that would start at 5 p.m. when a Telegraph would call for an immediate comment, through 24 hours of online and TV coverage until the next round of revelations would come again. Each one demanding, an immediate reaction, sometimes demanding an immediate resignation. So all the human drama that went with that, and all of it raising fundamental questions of integrity. There's a real test of leadership. And in the first few days, we really struggled with it. But then, funnily enough, by realizing what we had control of, David delivered a speech which laid the ground for real reform of MPs' expenses. And we got ahead of the crisis, and having done so, we could start to handle the day-to-day with calmer heads and a clearer strategy and direction. But it was a wretched time, especially for some MPs who frankly didn't deserve the kicking they were getting, although plenty absolutely did. But for me, as I say, it was an incredible stress workout, which I absolutely believe I benefited from when the missiles came with my name scrawled on the side. So when I then became the story, my stress muscles were in reasonable shape. And once I'd accepted the situation I was in, I was able to achieve that same clarity, to appreciate that, first and foremost, the long game really is the only game worth playing. And secondly, that nothing in life, serious illness aside, is forever, and is therefore irreversible. Now, I absolutely would not recommend any of you look for a career in the dying industry of newspapers or politics, for that matter, especially at the moment. But do look for ways to exercise your stress muscles, to develop your own crisis perspective, so that if or when the tsunami hits, you'll at least have your swimming costume on. It's about a change of mindset, really, I think, to embrace the problem solving that's a fundamental part of what it is to be human. To move, your reaction from, oh God, I've got to solve this problem, to I get to solve this problem. It's another awful bumper sticker, I know, but gratitude, I think, really is the attitude when it comes to problem solving, to exercising your stress muscle. So those are my three observations this evening, my three sort of practical takeaways, if you like, on how to prepare and deal with crisis. There are all manner of processes, platforms, methodologies loaded with consultant speak. Of course, in my business, we have our own that we deploy with corporate crises in particular. But for me, the start point, when you're at the center of the crisis and it's your life being impacted, it's all about first and foremost control. Take it by surrendering it. In other words, ignore the things that you can't control and put your effort into controlling the impact they might have on you. And by doing so, you'll get the clarity. You'll get the clarity to make much better decisions. Secondly, your gold, find it and put it to work. When you're in crisis, you'll have so much stuff swirling around your head. Concentrate on the things that are going to guide you out and ignore the white noise. And third, get stress fit, embrace it, don't run from it. So that's my recipe for a disaster, if you like. Before I finish, I thought I'd leave you with another final favorite piece of gold of mine, with apologies for the colorful language. I found it actually when sitting in my prison cell in HMP Hoseley Bay, watching TED on TV. Not the very fashionable thought leadership, gathering, but the film TED, the one about the soft toy that comes to life. And at the start of that movie, the narrator says, however big a splash you make in this world, whether you're Justin Bieber or a talking teddy bear, eventually, nobody will give a shit. Golden. Thanks for listening. And I'd be delighted to take your questions and have a chat.